We're outside again because it's Tennessee weather and this is what happens. And I'm doing a review of Gilgamesh, which this translation is by Stephen Mitchell. This is kind of a translation that he took sort of liberties with a little bit from what I understand, which thankfully actually makes it much more readable. I'm going back through trying to read some classic books, which just, I guess, to fill out my repertoire and say that I have read some of these. Now, that is not to necessarily say that some of these are not going to end up being DNF'd, because just because it's a classic doesn't mean I have to like it. Now, Gilgamesh, this one actually read through pretty well. This is one of the first major stories in classical literature, and it was made by the Sumerians. It's basically this story of this, like, epic strong man. He's a king named Gilgamesh, and he befriends this, they initially call him a wild man called Enkidu, and he kind of befriends this guy, and they're like, oh, they're wonderful brothers, and they go on a mission to kill a monster at some point. It's kind of your traditional thing. The part that's not so traditional is the ending part, where Enkidu kind of he dies. And Gilgamesh then proceeds to try to figure out how to either get eternal life or bring him back to life. And he goes on this quest to try to figure that out, and sort of the end result is basically you can't do that. So you sort of start out on this kind of journey about adventure and whatever else, and then it suddenly takes a very, like, philosophical turn towards the end. This is one of those stories that it has, to us, I would say, weird things popping through, because basically you've got the they say lusty on the back when they're talking about this, but Enkidu is basically tamed. He is a wild man, but he is tamed by one of the temple prostitutes coming out and basically, you know, loving him into civilization. And then you never see her again. She's just kind of a weird character that's thrown in there. You've got Gilgamesh is just kind of a jerk, just in general. That's even sort of what they talk about a little bit. But he and Enkidu are friends, and they go on this mission to kill this beast, and they do that relatively easily, it seems like. So there's that, and that's a traditional thing, and then they kind of fall into this weird thing about trying to defeat death. And what Gilgamesh finds is that you cannot. He goes and talks to, he's going on this quest to find Utnapishtim, who is basically this story's version of Noah, who lived through this flood and has eternal life now. And he goes to talk to him, and Utnapishtim is like, you can't, like that's, you can't cheat death, basically. And you can't cheat it for yourself, and you cannot cheat it to bring Enkidu back. And it's sort of just an interesting right-hand turn in the story that they're talking about adventure and this and that, and then all of a sudden takes a drastic turn into how do you beat death, and the answer is you don't. That is actually kind of the most interesting part of it to me. The whole ending was sort of just an interesting twist in how everything works. You also did have kind of this weird line that they keep talking about. He was like, I watched the body, and, you know, I kept waiting for him to come back to life, and then, like, maggots kept falling out of his face, and, you know, it was not working out. And that's when I got scared. And and that is kind of the thing, I think the feature at the end, which is the most interesting, is because you have this hero character who has repeatedly been doing all these different things, and at the end, he is admittedly scared of death. He admittedly, Enkidu dying basically gives him one of those moments where you start to question your own mortality. And that actually comes through, even in this thousands and thousands of year old story. Now, I will say this translation is very readable. It's still in the poetry format, but I think it is a much more artistically liberal way that they did this, as opposed to how the actual poem is done. So I think he kind of like made this all sort of flow a little bit better, and that's fine because it's very, very readable. The list that I'm going off of with these classic books, they give like lots of different translation options, and they give ones that they consider the best ones. This one was not their first choice, but they did say this one was very, very readable if you're not like into everything being word by word from the actual original form. So I would say this one's actually better than I thought it would be. This was one I was not particularly looking forward into reading. It just so happened that this one, they said, well, this one's a pretty readable translation of it. I picked it up and read it within like 2 days because it's not very long, but it does roll along pretty quickly. And it's pretty understandable in all of it. Right now I'm reading the Iliad, the translation of the Iliad. That one you got to work at a little bit. And I think I would be struggling more if I did not actually know the Greek mythology that went with it. But this one, I think anybody could pick up this one and sort of understand what is going on. Now, they might not necessarily condone some of the cultural things that are going on in some of this in different ways, because there are some other little features that you're just like, ooh, that's a weird cultural trend, but okay. Might not condone that, but they would at least understand what is happening and how it is happening in this book and what's going on. So if you're going to pick up a classic, if you're going to do a self-introduction into very old classic literature and getting yourself into this, and you're like, well, Gilgamesh, I should read that, the Stephen Mitchell version might be the one for you, because it is very understandable, has a very long introduction where he talks about the relevance of the book, and a lot of footnotes in the back to try to explain sort of culturally what is going on in some of this stuff too. So I would say for a beginner, getting into classical works as a beginner, this might be the one to go with. But other than that, far more readable than I expected it to be, far more maggots than I expected, and a far more philosophical turn at the end than it starts out in being in a very, very old text here. So, surprisingly readable ancient book.